If you like my videos, don't forget to subscribe and give a like. I would also appreciate a comment. And now, what school looked like in the Middle Ages. Alright, lean back and relax. I will tell you calmly and in detail what school meant in the Middle Ages. In the dark and often cold morning hours of medieval Europe, a school day began for a few selected children. School was not a place every child knew. On the contrary, only the sons of wealthy citizens, nobles, or future clerics gathered in the simple rooms, which were often part of a monastery or a church. Daughters were almost never taught, except in rare cases when they entered a convent. The schoolroom was plain. You can imagine a cold, drafty hall, perhaps with only a small window through which a weak ray of light fell. The floor was made of packed earth, or rough stone slabs, and furniture was scarce. The students often sat on simple wooden benches or sometimes directly on the floor. No one had their own desk, paper was expensive, and books were precious treasures, mostly handwritten and owned only by the teacher or the church. The teacher himself, often a monk or priest, was strict and paid scrupulous attention to discipline. Lessons meant hours of reciting and memorizing. There were no colorful blackboards, no writing notebooks, no drawings on the walls. Instead, you could hear the quiet, monotonous voices of the students reciting Latin prayers, Bible verses, or simple rules. The most important language was Latin, the language of the church and the educated. If you were lucky, you might sometimes write on a wax tablet, a small wooden frame filled with soft wax, into which you scratch letters with a stylus. The subjects were limited. Reading, a bit of writing, both in Latin and above all religious instruction, were the focus. The Bible was the central textbook. Mathematics, only as far as necessary to understand the church's calendar or do simple calculations. Geography, only as far as it appeared in biblical writings. The day was long and hard. The first lessons began early in the morning, and often the teaching lasted until early evening. The air in the classroom became stuffy, smelling of damp stone and the wax of the candles that were sometimes needed even during the day because the windows were tiny. The children's hands were often cold, their clothing scratchy and heavy, breaks hardly worth mentioning. Maybe there was a short pause to eat a piece of bread or drink some water. But playing or romping, not in the school context. Punishments, on the other hand, were omnipresent. Anyone who stumbled over the tongue twisters of Latin or refused to recite a verse could expect the rod. Physical punishment was a normal part of the school day. It was seen as a necessary means to shape the mind. School materials were precious. A book, if there was one at all, was a handmade manuscript. The teacher guarded it like a treasure and read from it. The children listened, repeated, and learned by heart. Mistakes were hardly tolerated. The teacher did not see himself as an explainer or motivator, but as a gatekeeper to knowledge and virtue. Learning was obedience. Questioning was dangerous. Especially in winter, the conditions were harsh. The room was cold. Candlelight flickered and cast shadows dancing on the walls. The children were cold and rubbed their hands as they recited their verses. Sometimes you could hear the wind whistling around the building outside, or the distant ringing of a church bell marking the hours. For the few who survived their school years, and perhaps later became clergy themselves, this education was the key to a better position. For everyone else, knowledge remained a tool of the church, a good strictly guarded and accessible only to selected circles. And so the days passed almost all the same, in cold rooms under strict supervision, with hardly any hope for distraction or joy. Learning in the Middle Ages was not a source of childhood development. It was discipline, duty, and obedience, a preparation for a life that would be hard and full of privation. Sometimes the school day was interrupted by special events, a church holiday, for example, on which lessons were canceled, or the rare visit of a high-ranking cleric inspecting the school. Then the tension among the students was even greater, as they had to recite particularly properly and withstand the strict gazes. But most of the time was marked by monotony. The morning often began with a prayer. The children knelt on the cold floor, fingers folded, eyes lowered. The prayer was spoken in Latin, a language they gradually came to understand. But that never felt familiar to them. They repeated the words mechanically as they had learned, without grasping the deeper meaning. The lessons in reading were just as arduous. Letters were named individually, then combined into syllables, then into words. There was no instruction in creative writing or storytelling. Stories, as we know them in today's schools, were frowned upon, as imagination was considered a danger to the soul. Everything learned served the purpose of being devout and obedient. For writing exercises, the children often used the already mentioned wax tablets. The styluses made of metal or bone were clumsy, and the children scratched letters into the wax, which they then had to smooth out again to make room for new exercises. Mistakes were easy to correct, but that also meant that nothing was lasting. Only the teacher possessed quill and ink, both too valuable for children's hands. And then there was arithmetic. Sparse as it was mainly related to the church's calendar. The days of the saints, the feasts, and fasting periods. Numbers were written with Roman numerals, and counting was often done using fingers or small stones. If the teacher was strict, and he almost always was, blows from a stick or rod came quickly, which were always kept within reach. Not out of malice, but because it was believed the body had to be restrained so that the soul could grow. There were also quieter punishments. A student had to stand for hours or kneel in a corner. The classrooms themselves were hardly decorated. Perhaps a crucifix hung on the wall or a picture of a saint. Otherwise, it was empty, plain, and functional. No colorful picture, no map, no object that could have stimulated the imagination. The windows were often covered with horn or thin parchment instead of glass. That was too expensive. The light was weak, the room dark, and in the cold season, it smelled of damp wood and smoke from the fires of the nearby monastery kitchen. The children who attended these schools often didn't realize how privileged they were. Outside, others their age worked hard in the fields, fetched water, gathered wood, or tended livestock. But in the eyes of the teacher, school was no gift, but a duty, one that had to be fulfilled with seriousness. At the end of the long day, when dusk darkened the land, the children were dismissed. Tired, exhausted, and often hungry, they made their way home, through muddy streets, past huts, stables, and dark alleys. Perhaps they repeated a prayer or a verse in their minds out of fear of forgetting it by the next morning. And so a school day in the Middle Ages passed, marked by strictness, cold, discipline, and the constant effort to meet the high demands of the church. The next morning, everything began again, often before the sun had properly reached the horizon. The call of the church bell woke the children in their simple beds, sometimes little more than a sack of straw on the floor. They washed themselves, if at all, with cold water from a wooden tub. Personal hygiene was a rare good in the Middle Ages anyway, and no one expected a student to come to school particularly clean. The way to school led over bumpy, muddy streets, past half-timbered houses and small stalls setting up their goods in the market. Sometimes the children encountered beggars, pilgrims, or merchants rumbling through the narrow alleys with their carts. The smell of smoke, manure, and foul water hung in the air, as the wastewater ran through open channels right through the town or village. Upon arriving at school, the day began again with a prayer. The teacher strictly checked whether everyone was punctual. Lateness was considered a sign of laziness and was quickly punished. Then followed more hours of reading, memorizing, and writing on the wax tablets. Sometimes lessons were accompanied by singing, Gregorian chants, or simple psalms that the students learned in order to take part in church services later. Here, too, it applied. The sound should be pure, the singing uniform, and without personal touch. Initiative was unwanted. The church was the only authority that decided what was good and right. The few books that existed were thick volumes bound in parchment, with artfully painted letters and tiny marginal drawings. But the children were hardly allowed to touch them. Only the teacher leafed through them, sometimes showing a picture or an initial that was elaborately decorated. For the students, these books were almost like holy objects, unreachable, awe-inspiring. Learning was a laborious, slow process. There were no school books that every child took home. All knowledge was shared in the room and had to be kept in the mind. Memorization was therefore the most important skill. Mistakes in recitation were not considered trifles, but expressions of carelessness or even sin. In the winter months, school was often held by candlelight because daylight was insufficient. Candles were valuable, so the room was usually only dimly lit. and the children had to strain their eyes to recognize the few letters or symbols on their tablets. The cold crept through the walls, and many sat with trembling hands while the teacher steadfastly delivered his material. Some schools, especially in larger towns, also offered higher education, a little grammar, rhetoric, or even a touch of logic. But that was rare and usually reserved for future clerics. For most, school ended with the ability to read simple Latin texts and pray, enough to find their place in church services, but not to gain knowledge independently. And so the years passed. Those who held out long enough might begin a career in the church, as a scribe, as a monk, perhaps even as a teacher for the next generation. But for the majority, school meant only a brief phase in life before they moved on to work in the fields, in workshops, or in the service of a lord. School in the Middle Ages was not a place of discovery, not a place of wonder. It was a tool of discipline and religion, a place where the mind was not meant to grow, but to submit. School in the Middle Ages was also a reflection of society, strictly hierarchical, shaped by obedience to authority. The teacher, often a simple monk or cleric himself, was the undisputed head of the room. He was judge, educator, and sometimes also a kind of guardian of morality. His task was not only to pass on knowledge, but above all, to prepare the children for a pious life, and to protect them from going astray. The children knew no participation in lessons, asking questions. That was rare and mostly unwanted, as it was considered presumptuous. The material was predetermined, and it was delivered in the same tone and with the same strictness, day after day, year after year. Those who were particularly talented were sometimes allowed to help the teacher copy texts. That was a great honor, and an even greater responsibility. A wrong letter in a holy text was a serious mistake. These few chosen ones then sat with quill and ink at a hard wooden table and wrote letters in accurate small handwriting on parchment that had previously been laboriously made from animal skin. For the majority of children, the goal of school was simply to be able to read and understand the Word of God, nothing more and nothing less. The idea that school could be a place of personal development or even of joy was foreign to the people of that time. Education was a means of order, discipline, and securing the divine order on earth. The school building itself also reflected this attitude, often part of a monastery or a church, a structure with thick stone walls, cool and forbidding, built to keep out the noise and temptations of the outside world. Sometimes during lessons, one could hear the singing of monks from the nearby chapel or the distant ringing of bells announcing the canonical hours. And when lessons finally ended, there was no cheering, no feeling of relief or joy. The children stood up, bowed to the teacher, and quietly made their way home. The way home was often just as full of hardship as the day itself. Cold wind, muddy paths, hungry dogs, sometimes a group of boys playing who would tease the students of the monastic school. At home, the children were often awaited by further duties, fetching wood, carrying water, helping with the livestock. Free time as we know it did not exist. School was only a small part of an already hard life shaped by work, prayer, and obedience. The memory of school days faded quickly once the children grew up, not because they had been so beautiful, but because they were just another chapter in a life full of toil. And yet, for the few who were allowed to continue learning, it was the first step on a path that could lead them to influence and respect. As scribes, as monks, perhaps as priests. Over the years, medieval schooling changed only slowly, even though new schools sometimes emerged in the large cities, such as the cathedral schools at the cathedrals, or the first beginnings of universities. Everyday school life for most children remained largely the same, monotonous, strict, and permeated by piety. The cathedral schools, which were founded mainly in cities like Paris, Cologne, or Bologna, were reserved for the most gifted students. Here, the curriculum was somewhat more diverse. In addition to reading and writing in Latin, the first elements of the so-called 7 liberal arts were introduced: grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, or logic, and sometimes arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But even here the goal remained clear: not free thinking, but a toolbox for the service of God. Discipline in these schools was often even stricter, because the level was higher. The teacher, often a canon or a scholar, expected the utmost attention. Mistakes were seen not only as carelessness but almost as an insult to the divine order. Corporal punishment was still common, and the teacher's rods rarely rested for long. It is interesting that the Middle Ages knew no compulsory schooling. Many children never saw the inside of a classroom. They learned what they needed for their lives from their parents or masters in a craft. Only those destined for the church or born into wealthy families received formal instruction. For the great mass of the population, school remained a distant, foreign concept, something associated with hard work, strictness, and the distant lords in monasteries or episcopal seats. Nevertheless, education radiated a certain magic, not in the sense that people saw it as something desirable, but because it was associated with power. Those who could read had access to the Bible, and thus to the Word of God. Those who could write could draft documents, draw up contracts, record property. That was a valuable asset in a time when the spoken word was often the only thing that counted, and that could quickly disappear like the wind. The importance of music and singing in lessons should not be underestimated either. The children learned psalms, hymns, and liturgical chants. These were part of daily rituals, not only in school but also later in worship. Choral singing was a means of making faith audible, of strengthening the community of believers, and also a way of imprinting the teachings on the children's minds. Sometimes the students were also recruited to help with church tasks, ringing the bells, carrying candles in processions, cleaning the altar. All of this was part of the larger whole of everyday school life. During the high holy days, Easter, Christmas, Pentecost, the rhythm of school life changed slightly. Lessons were sometimes canceled because the students were involved in the liturgy. They helped decorate the church, carried flags and candles in the long, solemn processions, or sang the psalms that shaped the sound of the festive Mass. But this was not a time of rest. It was rather another form of service, of duty to God and the community. The students' clothing was simple. They wore what their family could afford: a coarse shirt, a tunic, perhaps a woolen cloak in winter. Shoes were not always a given, especially not for children from poorer backgrounds. In the cold months they froze in the drafty schoolrooms, while the teacher, often better equipped, delivered his lessons wrapped in a thick cloak. A special event in the school year was the so-called learning to write with ink. This happened only rarely and was a solemn moment that marked the transition from the wax tablet to parchment. The teacher would choose a day when the students had been particularly attentive and obedient. Then a small amount of precious ink was prepared, the quill sharpened, and under strict supervision, the student was allowed to write his first letters, shaky, slow, full of reverence. A mistake meant shame. A successful word brought an approving nod from the teacher. The rules in school were strict. Anyone who spoke without being asked, who laughed or whispered, faced immediate punishment. The goal was to shape the children into obedient servants of God. Personal thoughts, doubts, creativity, none of that was encouraged. Faith stood above all, and the knowledge that was imparted served solely to support that faith. The few children who were particularly gifted could hope to be accepted into a monastery after school, where they were allowed to continue learning grammar, theology, perhaps even a little philosophy. These children later became scribes, chroniclers, perhaps teachers. Most of the others, however, returned after a few years of schooling to the field, the workshop, the household, with just enough knowledge to follow the service and manage a simple life. Outside the school walls, life went on. Merchants offered their goods, craftsmen hammered in their workshops, farmers drove their livestock through the lanes. The school was like a small island of order in a world shaped by hardship and the struggle for survival. Particularly impressive was the so-called memorization of the Psalms, one of the central tasks of the students. Each student had to learn numerous psalms and prayers by heart over time, often in a language he did not truly understand, Latin. Memorization was done through endless repetition, mostly in chorus, sometimes recited individually while the teacher stood nearby listening attentively. The words had to be perfect. A wrong verse or an omitted word was considered a serious negligence and was met with reproach or even punishment. The sound of these softly murmuring children's voices, hour after hour reciting the holy texts in cold, echoing rooms, was part of the everyday life of medieval schools. The rhythmic murmuring was so familiar that it almost seemed like the background noise of the time. The students sat on simple wooden benches, often without a backrest, sometimes only on a piece of wood or stone. Their fingers froze, their backs ached, but the murmuring of the psalms continued. On and on. Learning arithmetic was also part of the curriculum in the better schools, but it was usually limited to the essentials: counting, basic arithmetic, a little knowledge of numbers for everyday life. The digits were written with a stylus on wax tablets and repeatedly wiped off and written again. Paper was too precious to give to children for practice. The arithmetic tasks mainly served the purpose of enabling the student later to take on simple administrative duties in the church or in the service of a lord, such as counting natural tributes or recording quantities. The schoolrooms themselves were sparse. On the walls there might hang a crucifix, a simple image of a saint, sometimes a single large book chained to the wall so that no one could steal it. It was quiet in these rooms, apart from the murmuring of the students and the teacher's instructions. Every step, every sound echoed through the stone walls. The school was not a place of joy, but a place of service. The children knew this. They endured it silently, just as they silently endured much in their hard lives. Some probably dreamed of one day becoming a teacher or a monk themselves, but most longed for the day when they could leave school and follow the call of work. Yet even then the shadow of the school remained over them. What they had learned was not so easily forgotten. The psalms and prayers accompanied them through life, at work, at prayer, at death. In addition to lessons and rituals, school in the Middle Ages was also a place where social differences became visible. Although the children often sat next to each other on the same bench, the teacher knew exactly whose father was a wealthy merchant, a respected craftsman, or a poor servant. The children of the rich often received a bit more leniency. Perhaps the son of a city councilor could make a mistake without the rod being taken up immediately. For the poor, on the other hand, the rule was they had to try twice as hard not to stand out, not to be considered disruptive or stupid. For education in the Middle Ages was also a means of maintaining the existing order, and the students learned early to accept their place in this order. The few moments of joy at school were often linked to the church year. On certain days, for example on the feast of St. Nicholas, the school routine was somewhat relaxed. Then the children were allowed to recite small poems, perform simple plays, or sing a special psalm. The best student was sometimes appointed child bishop. For one day he was allowed to walk around the church in ceremonial clothing and symbolically play the bishop. Of course, everything was strictly supervised, and the fun remained within the bounds of what was permitted. But it was a bright spot in an otherwise gray school routine. Even outside school, the children's lives were marked by hard work and deprivation. The way to school was often dangerous, in the cold months icy, full of potholes, sometimes populated by stray dogs or drunken adults. And those who came from the village often had to walk long distances, in rain, snow, or blazing sun. The lunch break was rarely more than a brief pause. Those who were lucky brought a piece of bread or cheese from home. Many children, however, had to wait out their hunger until classes ended in the late afternoon. Then they went home, where the next duties were often already waiting. Fetching water, collecting firewood, tending the livestock. In all this, school was a small window into a world that remained closed to most children. The world of books, writing, the holy texts. They perhaps sensed that behind the Latin words lay more than they could understand, but that remained a secret of the teachers and the monks, a treasure that only a few were allowed to unearth. Over the years, a silent hierarchy often developed among the students, not officially established, but ever present. The children who were especially good at memorization or had the neatest handwriting were favored by the teacher. They sat closer to him, received the better tasks, and might even be allowed to carry the psalter or another valuable book. The weaker students, on the other hand, sat further back, sometimes downright apart, and felt the teacher's impatience when they faltered or made a mistake. Among the children themselves, small communities formed. Some forged friendships, often with those who came from similar backgrounds. Others remained alone, either because they were too shy or because their origins isolated them. Bullying, as we would call it today, certainly occurred. A poorly dressed child who didn't understand the material was teased or left behind by the others on the way home. But in a time when life was hard for everyone, there was little room for compassion. Sometimes, very rarely, the children received a visit from a traveling preacher, a learned monk, or, in the cities, a master from the university. Then there was great excitement. The stranger brought new stories, perhaps spoke of distant lands, pilgrimages, relics, or miracles. For a moment, the school became a window into the great unknown world. But as soon as the guest was gone, the gray everyday life returned. The wax tablet, the psalms, the stern gaze of the teacher. There were also exams, though different from what we know today. No written tests, but an oral presentation before the teacher, perhaps before the priest or the abbot. The student had to recite a psalm, explain a Bible passage, sometimes read a small text aloud. The exam was public. Every mistake was embarrassing, every correct answer a small triumph. The school year had no fixed beginning and no set end. Classes followed the church festivals, the harvest time, and the needs of the community. If the village needed help with the harvest, school was canceled. If a great mass was being prepared, the students were obliged to assist. Education was important, but it always served the community and the faith. The rooms where lessons were held remained simple. No colorful pictures on the walls, no maps, no teaching aids, except perhaps an abacus made of wooden beads. The pride of every school was its psalter, sometimes a gospel book, artfully written and illuminated, carefully guarded, often kept in a chest. In winter, the days were especially hard for the students. Their numb fingers could barely hold the stylus. Their icy breath hung in small clouds before their faces. All of this made learning even more difficult. There were no heated classrooms. A small fire in a corner, if there was one at all, was reserved for the teachers. The children sat close together to share a little warmth while they murmured the same verses over and over. The light was dim. Candles were expensive, so lessons often began at dawn and ended when daylight began to fade. In the twilight, the children sat hunched over their tablets, their eyes straining to make out the wax letters, while the teacher dictated the next verse in a muted voice. The scratching of the stylus on the wax blended with the quiet murmuring of prayers, a sound that characterized the medieval school day. It was not uncommon for children to have to leave school because their families needed them, in the fields, the smithy, or the home. Education was a privilege not everyone could afford for long. The teacher barely noted it. It was a silent understanding that the necessities of life took precedence over the curriculum. The teachers themselves often led simple, withdrawn lives. They were rarely wealthy, and many lived in modest dwellings near the church or monastery. They were regarded with respect, but their task was difficult. They had to shape children who would often rather have been playing or working outside, and they had to do so with the means at their disposal. Stern words, the rod, the example of their disposal. Stern words, the example of their own lives. The books they used were mostly unique copies, handwritten by monks with painstaking care. Each page was a work of art, treated with reverence. The children were rarely allowed to touch these books. They could look at them while the teacher read from them or pointed out verses. Sometimes the teacher told of how such a book was made, of the monk's labor, of grinding the ink, of stretching the parchment. For the children, these were stories of almost magical allure, and again, everyday life returned. The early rising, the walk through rain or snow, the endless repetition, the hope for a kind glance from the teacher, or a small gesture of praise. There were also moments when the school itself became the setting for larger events. For example, when a new priest came to the village and the students stood in neat rows in front of the church to greet him with psalms or a Latin phrase. Then they had to appear particularly cleanly dressed, as well as could be managed, and recite their texts without a single mistake. The teacher was stricter than ever in such moments, because the honor of the school was at stake. Occasionally, in the cities or larger villages, children from wealthier families were sent for more advanced instruction. There they learned what most children never got to hear: the 7 liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, all in Latin, all strictly according to the rules of the church and the ancient scholars. For the children from humble backgrounds, however, lessons remained simple. Psalms, prayers, a little arithmetic, a little reading, just enough to be devout and to understand the commandments of God. The behavior of the children outside of lessons also mattered to the teacher, or rather, he saw it as his duty to monitor it. Anyone who played too loudly, quarreled on the way home, or even swore could expect punishment the next morning. School did not end at the threshold. It extended into every part of the children's lives. There were rare exceptions to the strictness. For example, when a pupil carved a particularly beautiful drawing into the edge of his wax tablet and the teacher, instead of scolding, gave an approving nod, or when a child recited a psalm especially solemnly in church and the priest put in a good word for him. Such moments stayed long in the children's memory. Small lights in an otherwise uniform, demanding daily routine. The furnishings of the schools were as simple as could be imagined. No blackboard on the wall, no maps, no colorful letters or numbers like in later times. A table for the teacher, benches for the pupils, a book, a crucifix. That was all. And yet, this space often felt like a different world for the children. A place where words had power, where writing was sacred, where the knowledge of the ancients was hidden in signs they struggled to decipher. During recess, brief as it was, the children came alive a little. They ran about in the schoolyard, which was usually no more than an uneven patch of ground in front of the building or the church. The games were simple: throwing stones or small pieces of wood, tug-of-war with old ropes, barefoot races over the hard ground. There were no toys as we know them today. The children made a game out of anything they could find. A particularly smooth pebble became a treasure, a stick a sword. Yet even in these moments, the gaze of the teacher or an older pupil could be felt. Too much noise, a quarrel, a harsh word, all this could arouse the teacher's anger. Recess was therefore also a balancing act, a brief moment to catch their breath, but always under the watchful eye of authority. It was not uncommon for the children to have to perform small chores during recess. The teacher would send them to fetch water, stoke the fire, sweep the classroom. Sometimes a pupil had to run to the priest to deliver a message, a task carried out with great seriousness, for anyone who bungled it or dawdled risked punishment. The dreams of the children were often as modest as their daily life was hard. Perhaps to one day be able to read for themselves what was written in the great book, perhaps to go to the city and become an apprentice, to a scribe, a craftsman, a merchant. Some dreamed of the freedom of the fields, of life as a shepherd or servant, where they would escape the strict order of the school. And despite all the hardship, something remained with them. The words of the Psalms, the verses they had repeated so often that they were etched deep into their memory. Even if they never saw another book, these words accompanied them through life. In prayer, at work, in death. The school in the Middle Ages was not a place for play, not a place of childhood as we understand it, but a place of formation, of discipline, of preparation for a life that for most would be hard and full of privation. Punishments in the medieval school were as commonplace as the lessons themselves. A child who failed to memorize a psalm, wrote a letter incorrectly, or behaved restlessly in class had to expect consequences. The teacher usually reached for the rod. A thin stick or willow branch used to strike the hands, back, or buttocks. The pain was meant to be linked with the lesson. Mistakes meant punishment, obedience meant peace. Sometimes the punishment consisted of a child having to remain on their knees before the teacher, on hard ground, perhaps on a stone or a log, for hours if necessary. Other times the pupil had to recite the alphabet or a psalm over and over again until their voice was hoarse. In rare cases, especially in the face of persistent disobedience, a child was expelled from class, but this was considered a great shame for the family, so it happened only seldom. And yet, not everything was harsh and gray. There were also rewards, albeit modest ones. A word of praise from the teacher could fill a child with pride. A simple bene, good, or an approving nod carried great weight. Some schools introduced small tokens of recognition, a beautiful pebble placed on the best pupil's desk by the teacher, or the right to light a candle in the church. The feast days of the church year brought welcome variety. Christmas, Easter, the feast of St. Nicholas, or the name day of the school's patron saint were occasions when lessons were shorter or canceled altogether. Then the school was allowed to join the procession in simple garments with candles or small banners. The pride in this was great. The children knew they were part of something bigger. Especially exciting was the arrival of a new book at the school. The teacher would show it with reverence, leaf through it slowly, let the children marvel at the artfully painted letters. For many, this was the only moment when they felt they could touch the distant world of knowledge with their own hands. The teachers in the Middle Ages led a life that was hardly less deprived than that of their students. They were often clerics or aspiring monks, men who lived in poverty themselves and saw their task as a service to God. Their clothing was simple, a worn-out habit or a plain garment, sometimes with patched areas, for wealth was foreign to them. Many of them received no fixed salary. They lived on what the village community or the children's parents could give them: a loaf of bread, a jug of milk, a bundle of wood for the winter. Some received a modest room in the rectory or near the monastery, and often that was their only security. Despite all these hardships, many teachers felt deeply committed to their task. They were convinced that what they taught the children, reading the holy texts, proper prayer, understanding the commandments, was a foundation that should secure their salvation. And so they adhered to strictness, because in their view leniency was tantamount to negligence toward the will of God. The worries of the teachers were numerous. They had to organize lessons, often without help, sometimes with dozens of children of different ages and levels of knowledge. They had to ensure that discipline prevailed, that the church was satisfied, that the parents had no complaints. And last but not least, they had to remain vigilant themselves, because a mistake in teaching, a misquoted word from the Bible, could bring upon them the wrath of the priest or the abbot. And yet there were moments when even a teacher showed a smile. Perhaps when a student finally recited a difficult psalm without error. Perhaps when a child from poor circumstances showed an astonishingly clear handwriting or gave a clever answer. These small victories were what brightened the gray everyday life a little. The teachers often knew the stories of the great scholars of the time, of Bede the Venerable, of Isidore of Seville, of the brilliant minds who worked at distant universities. They knew that their small school was only a tiny part of this world of knowledge, but they did their best to pass on that spark. The way to school was a daily trial for most children, often harder than the lessons themselves. Some walked many kilometers over muddy paths, through forests or across open fields, in rain, snow, or blazing summer heat. Not all owned shoes. Many went barefoot, their feet rough and hardened from the daily march. The way was not without danger. Stray dogs, sinister figures, wild animals, especially in the more remote areas, made the way to school an adventure that required courage. The children often walked in groups, both for safety and to encourage one another. They sang psalms or simple rhymes along the way, not only for entertainment but also as protection. Belief in the power of the spoken word was strong. Sometimes a procession crossed their path, and the children stopped reverently, took off their caps or made the sign of the cross before continuing. The start of a new school year was not a fixed date as we know it today. Usually, school began after an important church festival or after harvest time, when the work in the fields was done. The first day of school was marked by simple but meaningful customs. The children were blessed by the teacher in the church. Sometimes they had to kneel before the altar and say a prayer. The parents, if they were present, asked for God's assistance on their children's path of learning. Sometimes a new child received a small token of admission, a blessed piece of bread, a simple staff that was meant to symbolically represent the path of learning. These gestures were reminders that school was not purely a secular place, but part of God's plan for every Christian. When a child left school, whether after years of learning or after a short time because the family needed them, it often happened without much ceremony. School was a place of passage, not a home. Some students carried on what they had learned. As altar servers, as scribes, as apprentices to a scholar or craftsman. Most, however, returned to the field, the workshop, the stable. But the little knowledge they had acquired stayed with them. The prayers, the psalms, the ability to read a simple word or have a letter read aloud by a priest. There were those rare, almost miraculous stories of children from small village schools who made the leap into the great world of scholars. It usually began with the watchful eye of a teacher or priest who noticed that a student understood more, learned faster, or read unusually well. Perhaps it was a child who picked up a Latin verse and quoted it correctly, or one who, when copying a psalm, showed particularly beautiful handwriting. Such children were sometimes recommended to the monastery, where they were accepted as novices and further educated. There they learned not only the passages of the Bible, but also the art of writing and copying, arithmetic, and, with much luck, natural science. For most, the monastery was the highest goal, a place where knowledge was gathered like precious treasures, where books were secured with heavy chains and the light of scholarship glowed quietly in the cold scriptoriums. The very few who were truly exceptional eventually found themselves at a cathedral school, or even at one of the early universities, in Paris, in Bologna, in Oxford. Such children became almost legendary in the tales of the villagers. He knew the whole Mass by heart, already at 10. He wrote so beautifully that even the abbot shook his head. Such stories were passed from mouth to mouth, embellished, and carried on. For the village, these children were a small source of pride, proof that even from the poorest hut someone could emerge who spoke the language of the scholars. But this path was arduous, and separation from the family was final. Those who went to the monastery or to the school of the city rarely returned to simple village life. Soon, pious legends also grew around such children. It was said that a gifted student was inspired by a divine dream, or that a holy man appeared to him at night and showed him the alphabet. Whether true or invented, these stories kept the faith alive that education could be a gift from heaven. School life in the Middle Ages was marked by strict discipline, firm faith, and a clear hierarchy between teacher and students. The day often began early, sometimes with the first toll of the bell at sunrise. The children had to gather, sometimes in front of the church, sometimes in the schoolroom, and the first thing they did was a communal prayer. The school prayer was not just a pious duty, it was also a reminder that learning was in the service of God. Lessons consisted almost exclusively of memorization. The children learned psalms, prayers, the 10 Commandments, and short biblical stories, all in Latin, even though they often hardly understood it. Learning to read began with the letters of the alphabet, usually with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as they repeated the letters. Writing was sacred, and so the alphabet itself was treated as something holy. Only a few received writing lessons, mostly boys destined from the start for church service or the monastery. They wrote on wax tablets or, if the school was wealthy enough, on parchment or paper. The quill was made from goose feathers, the ink homemade from soot, gallnuts, and wine or vinegar. Mistakes were hard to correct, so the greatest care was necessary. The daily routine was strictly scheduled. After morning prayer and the first part of the lesson, there was often a short break. Then they continued memorizing verses or listening to Bible stories. There were no colorful picture books or visual aids. The teacher read aloud. The children listened and repeated. The schoolrooms were bare, simple wooden benches, a table for the teacher, perhaps a crucifix or a holy image on the wall. In winter it was cold, in summer stuffy. Candles or oil lamps provided light on dark days, but they were expensive and used sparingly. Social interaction among the children was also strictly regulated. Older students supervised the younger ones and had to report to the teacher if someone was restless or made a mistake. Friendship was possible, but always under the shadow of the strictness of daily life. Besides lessons, there was also moral education. The children learned what sin was, how to behave in church, how to obey their parents and the Lord. School was not just a place of knowledge, but above all, a place of character formation in the spirit of the church. In the towns and villages, schools varied greatly depending on where they were located and who operated them. In a small village, the school was often just a room in the rectory or an annex to the church. The teacher was usually the priest himself or a cleric, who in addition to teaching, also said Mass, and was responsible for pastoral care. The number of students was manageable, perhaps 10, 20 children, boys, and, in rare cases, a few girls from better-off families. In the town, on the other hand, there were often larger schools, cathedral schools attached to the cathedrals, or monastic schools run by monks. Here, the teaching was more demanding. In addition to reading, writing, and religious texts, Latin grammar, rhetoric, and sometimes the basics of arithmetic were taught. The students were often sons of merchants, craftsmen, or wealthier citizens who could afford education for their children. Girls were mostly excluded from the medieval school system. Only in a few convent schools or canonices institutions did they receive instruction. Mainly daughters of the nobility or rich citizens who were placed in the convent or prepared for a life as a nun. There they mainly learned to read religious texts, sometimes to write, to do needlework, and the rules of monastic life. For most girls, education was limited to what they heard at home from their parents or the clergy in the village. Special days in the school year were connected to the church calendar. St. Martin's Day, Christmas, Easter, These festivals brought a break in the strict school routine. Sometimes the school was allowed to take part in the procession, sing songs, or carry banners. For the children, this was a highlight. For a moment, they could step out of the strictness of everyday life, be part of a greater, solemn whole, and feel that their learning was seen and appreciated. At some schools, there was the custom that the best students recited psalms or Bible passages before the congregation at the end of the year. A public proof of their ability, and at the same time a reminder to the others to be diligent. Such occasions were rare, but they remained in the children's memory because they brought variety and were sometimes linked to small rewards such as blessed bread or a candle. The cathedral schools were the most prestigious educational institutions in the Middle Ages, often the only path to advance beyond simple school knowledge into the world of scholars. They were under the supervision of the bishop or cathedral chapter, and their teachers were usually priests or monks with higher education. Here, students were taught the septem artis liberales, the 7 liberal arts, which were considered the foundation of all higher learning. These arts were divided into 2 groups, the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, formed the basis. The goal was to master the Latin language perfectly, to use it skillfully, and to argue correctly. The teaching was strict and conducted in Latin. The students had to memorize texts, provide explanations, and practice in disputations, small debates in which they demonstrated their skills in argumentation. Only those who had mastered the trivium were allowed to proceed to the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These subjects led out into the world of numbers, measurements, and the celestial order, all seen as part of God's plan. Music did not mean playing instruments, but understanding the divine harmony in numbers and tones. Astronomy was the study of the movements of stars and planets, which were regarded as a reflection of divine order. Examinations were rare in the form we know today. Instead, students had to demonstrate their knowledge publicly by reciting texts, solving tasks set by the teacher, or engaging in disputations before the teacher or the community. It was a constant testing and being observed, not a single exam, but an ongoing struggle to meet the standard. The transition into adult life was often gradual. For most, the end of school meant entering their father's professions, as farmers, craftsmen, servants, or maids. A few, however, stayed at the schools, becoming teachers or clerics themselves. They served at altars, copied books in scriptoria, or went on to universities if they had the means or the recommendation of a powerful patron. Sometimes it was life itself that ended the school path. Illness, the duty to work on the farm, wars, or famine. School was a privilege, and by no means a matter of course. School life in the Middle Ages was often marked by strict discipline and was firmly embedded in the rhythm of the church and nature. The days began early, often with the first light of dawn or the ringing of the church bells. The school day followed the prayer times of the church, matins in the morning, terce, sext, and none in the late morning and early afternoon, and finally vespers in the evening. In between, there was learning, praying, and practicing. The lessons mostly consisted of communal recitation. The teacher spoke first, and the children responded in chorus. This method strongly shaped the memory, but was also monotonous and required constant attention. The students sat on simple benches, often without desks. They held their tablets on their knees or on small stands. The rooms were sparse, sometimes little more than an empty chamber in the parsonage or a corner of the church. Tool materials were precious. Those who were lucky were allowed to write on a wax tablet, whose soft surface could be inscribed with a stylus and later smoothed out again. Parchment and paper were valuable and used only in the higher schools or by particularly talented students. Books were rare and often read together. The teacher held them in his hand or placed them on the altar. The children were not allowed to touch them. The fear of damage was too great. Beatings were an everyday educational tool. The teacher carried a stick or a rod and did not hesitate to use it for dawdling, for mistakes in praying or reciting, for inattentiveness, or for restless behavior. The punishments were considered part of education toward godliness and discipline. There were even prescribed punishments for specific errors. For example, a child could receive 3 strokes for misquoting a psalm, and twice as many for cheeky behavior. Breaks were rare, and leisure was an unfamiliar concept. After school, work usually awaited. The children had to help in the fields, herd livestock, or lend a hand in the workshop. Only on major feast days, on the days after great processions, or on special occasions like the arrival of a bishop or prince, was there a break from lessons. Despite all the hardships, there were also bright moments. When a difficult text was finally understood, when the teacher praised, which was rare, or when the school was allowed to take part in church festivals. Then the children carried lights in the procession, sang psalms, or performed small sacred plays, and there was a deep connection between learning and faith. All knowledge was considered a gift from God. Those who learned did so not only for themselves, but for the glory of the Creator. Girls in the medieval school system often led a shadowy existence. Education was usually not intended for them because their role in society was clearly defined. They were to be wives and mothers, or if they did not marry, enter a convent. But there, in the convents and collegiate churches, some girls received an education that went far beyond what was usual for women of that time. In convents for nuns, such as the famous Benedictine or Cistercian abbeys, there were schoolrooms where young novices learned to read, and sometimes also to write. The aim was to understand the liturgy and to be able to join in the daily prayers. Particularly gifted women were entrusted with copying manuscripts or took on organizational tasks in the convent that required education. The textbooks of the time were simple and precious at the same time. For beginners, there was the so-called abecedarium, an alphabet book with simple letters and short prayers. Those who advanced learned with the psalterium, the book of Psalms, which was the basis of almost all spiritual education. Advanced students were given access to the disticha catonish, moral maxims, or to simple Latin grammars, as were often written in the early Middle Ages by Irish or Anglo-Saxon monks. The books themselves were works of art, handwritten on parchment, decorated with ornate initials, often in red, blue, or gold. They were so valuable that they were secured with chains to prevent them from being stolen. Only the teacher or the abbot was allowed to take them from the cupboard and open them. Owning a book was a sign of wealth and learning. Many teachers barely owned a single copy. The convents were the true centers of learning in the Middle Ages. They collected knowledge, preserved ancient writings, and educated the few who were allowed to learn to read and write. In their scriptoria, monks and nuns often sat for hours by candlelight, copying Bibles, legends of the saints, and theological works. The children who were educated in the convent were sometimes allowed to look over these scholars' shoulders. For them, it was a glimpse into a world otherwise closed to them. The influence of the convents on the school system was enormous. They not only provided teachers but also shaped the curriculum. All knowledge was imbued with the Christian faith. Every subject served to understand and glorify God. Even counting and measuring were seen as a way to recognize divine order. The first universities, which emerged in the High Middle Ages, were a direct development of the cathedral and monastic schools. They offered what was then considered the highest form of education: systematic training in theology, law, medicine, or the liberal arts. Places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford became centers of knowledge that attracted students from all over Europe. But before students were even allowed to attend a university, they usually had to pass through the rigorous schooling of the cathedral schools. Those who made the leap encountered a completely new world. The universities were places of debate, reflection, and inquiry. Unlike the strict schools of childhood, here there was room for discussion and for weighing different opinions, though always within the limits tolerated by the church. The teachers at the universities were often priests, but no longer necessarily monks. They read from the works of ancient authors, from Bible commentaries, from the writings of the church fathers, and explained, interpreted, and connected them. The students usually sat packed together in cold lecture halls or outdoors, took notes as best they could, and often lived in great poverty. But not all education took place at universities or in permanent schools. There were also traveling schools, itinerant teachers who moved from place to place offering their services. They taught in inns, town halls, or in the open air. The students paid them with goods, a few coins, or with work. Some of these teachers were honorable men, others more like adventurers who made promises of quick learning, took the money and moved on. In the scriptoria of the monasteries, life followed its own rhythm. Silence was mandatory, the work strictly divided. One copied the text, another painted the initials, a third checked the work for errors. The children who were educated in the monastery were usually not allowed to enter these rooms, but the smell of parchment, ink, and wood smoke, the soft scratching of quills, all this left a deep impression on their memory. The everyday life of the scholars was arduous. Books were not printed. That would only happen with the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. Every page was crafted by hand, every book a treasure. Those who could read belonged to a small privileged class. The everyday life of students, whether in a small monastic school or at a cathedral school, was strictly regulated, not only during lessons but also outside of them. Many schools offered the children a kind of boarding life, especially if they came from more distant villages. The dormitories were simple, long rows of straw sacks or plain wooden benches where the children rested. A blanket made of coarse fabric, a small box for personal belongings. There was little else. The sleeping quarters were usually cold and drafty, and candles were forbidden to prevent fires. The food likewise reflected the simplicity and austerity of the time. In large dining halls, often the same rooms that served as classrooms, the children sat in silence during meals. The food usually consisted of porridge, bread, some vegetables, and rarely cheese or meat. On special days, such as major feast days, the fare was more generous. Perhaps there was a piece of meat or a fried egg. Meal began and ended with prayer, and during eating, one of the older students read aloud from the Bible or the lives of the saints. Despite the strict rules, the children, as children always do, sought small pleasures and ways to distract themselves. There were quiet pranks. Someone would hide a neighbor's stylus, secretly fill the inkwell with water, or draw tiny figures on another's wax tablet with the stylus. Or such pranks risked punishment, but the children accepted this because it brightened the drab school day for a moment. Play was not entirely absent either. In the short breaks or on the way to church, the children threw stones, played tag, or tried simple throwing games with nuts or small bones. But such games were often viewed with suspicion, as they were seen as improper and as distractions from the true goal, to serve God and to learn. At the end of school, there was usually no formal graduation like a modern certificate. Instead, teachers in the community simply recognized who was good enough to enter the service of the church, or who might be needed as a scribe, teacher, or assistant. Those who were especially diligent or clever sometimes received a letter of recommendation, which could open the door to a higher school or a university. And that too was typical of medieval school life. It was always a service to the Lord, the church, the community. Personal ambition played a minor role. The goal was the good of the whole. Music and singing played an important role in everyday medieval school life, for they were seen not only as an art form, but as a way to live and learn the faith. Instruction in singing often began in the early school years. The children memorized psalms and hymns, not just to sing them at services, but also because singing trained memory. The melodies helped them retain the long Latin texts in their minds, a kind of musical mnemonic that left a deep impression. Gregorian chant was the centerpiece of this training. In the church halls or sparse schoolrooms, the students practiced in small groups or under the direction of the cantor, who was responsible for the singing. The children stood in rows, listened attentively to the cantor, and repeated the melodies again and again. It was a slow, patient learning process that required much discipline. The significance of singing extended far beyond the school. At processions, festivals, and church ceremonies, the children's choir was often part of the solemn proceedings. Those who sang well had the chance to stand out on special occasions, a rare moment of pride in an otherwise humility-focused school day. Singing was also a means of strengthening the community. Singing together created a bond among the students, no matter whether they came from poor or rich families. And it was an expression of order and harmony, virtues that permeated medieval education and religious life. Between teachers and students, there was a strict, often distant relationship. The teacher was a figure of respect, educator, preacher, and judge all in one. Friendship or familiarity was rare. It was about obedience and submission. Nevertheless, some students developed deep admiration for their teachers, especially when they were fair and kind. And then there were the examinations at the universities. Those who had come this far had to prove themselves in what were called disputations. These were public debates where the candidate answered questions, defended theses, and refuted counter-arguments, all in Latin. These exams were tough and required not only knowledge but also courage, as they often took place before a large audience. Those who passed were allowed to bear the title of bachelor or master, a distinction that opened doors and brought esteem. The clothing of students in the Middle Ages was as simple as their daily lives. Children from poor families usually wore coarse wool tunics, often in earthy colors like brown, gray, or dirty white. The fabrics were rough, heavy, and scratchy, since linen or finer cloth was expensive and reserved for the wealthy. Shoes were equally simple, often just leather scraps tied around the foot with straps, or in summer the children went barefoot. Those who attended a cathedral school or one of the better monastic schools sometimes wore uniform clothing, a kind of school habit that clearly showed they were part of the community. These garments were often modeled after the clothing of the clergy. A simple long robe, a belt made of rope or leather, and in winter a coarse cloak against the cold. When students traveled to a university, for example to Paris, Bologna, or Oxford, it was an adventure in itself. The journey was arduous and dangerous. The roads were bad, robbers lurked in the forests, and the young scholars often banded together in groups for protection. Some universities even formed their own nations, associations of students from the same region, to support one another. The students lived in simple lodgings, often in dark chambers that they shared with several companions. They had to economize wherever they could, shared bread and cheese, and earned money by copying books or teaching younger students. And then there were the first libraries, true treasure chambers of knowledge. These were usually located in monasteries or cathedral schools. The books were carefully chained to prevent theft. A student could borrow a book only with the teacher's permission, and usually only to read it in the library itself. The shelves were made of heavy wood, the room often cold and dark, lit only by a few candles or small windows. The books were handwritten, richly decorated, and each one was the result of many months of hard work. That is why each book was so precious that it was sometimes worth more than a small house. The students who had the privilege of learning in such a library knew they had access to something rare and valuable. The eating habits of students in the Middle Ages were shaped by frugality and often by scarcity. Many young men who studied at the universities came from poor backgrounds or had spent all their money on the journey and tuition fees. They lived on what was cheap and easy to obtain: dark bread, beans, peas, cabbage, and sometimes a piece of salted herring or cheese. Meals were often taken together, in small groups of fellow students who shared a lodging and the little they had. Cooking was done in simple pots over an open fire, and the taste of the meals was usually as plain as their ingredients. Water was the main drink, but students often drank thin beer or diluted wine, because the water in the cities was not always clean. Especially poor students went begging or sang songs in the streets to ask for a few coins or some bread. Others worked as scribes, helped craftsmen, or offered their services as teachers for younger pupils. From these communities, student brotherhoods gradually emerged. They were more than just practical alliances. The brotherhoods offered protection, helped in cases of illness or hardship, and organized communal celebrations on church holidays. Some of these brotherhoods had strict rules regulating the behavior of their members, from daily prayer to prohibitions on drunkenness or quarrels. Others were more loosely organized and resembled later student associations. They met to sing, play, and, if they could afford it, to drink. The examination rituals at the universities were serious affairs. They often consisted of public disputations. The student had to present a thesis, justify it, and defend himself against the objections of the listeners, before teachers and fellow students. Everything was conducted in Latin, the language of scholars. Anyone who embarrassed himself or could not answer lost respect. Those who passed were often allowed to formally receive the title of bachelor or master, with a small ceremony in which the candidate sometimes received a special cap or a wreath. The living conditions of students in the Middle Ages were often as meager as their daily lives. Many lived in small, damp chambers that they shared with 2, 3, or even more companions. The rooms were poorly heated, and the furniture usually consisted of a hard cot, a simple table, and perhaps a chest in which they kept their few belongings. Often they simply slept on straw sacks, which were regularly infested with vermin. In university towns like Paris or Bologna, students lived in tiny alleys in cheap lodgings, or with innkeepers who specialized in housing young scholars. It was often noisy and dirty. Dogs, chickens, and sometimes pigs roamed the streets, and at night, it was anything but quiet in the narrow quarters. Despite the harsh living conditions, students sought ways to spend their leisure time. Some spent their few free hours with music. They sang folk songs, played simple instruments like flutes or fiddles. Others met in taverns, where over a mug of thin beer they exchanged stories, discussed, or played dice games, although such games were often forbidden. There were also students who devoted themselves to poetry, expressing their worries, hunger, or love in Latin verses. Of course, student life was not without rules, and those who broke them had to expect punishments. The universities and towns had their own jurisdictions. Minor offenses like making noise at night, drunkenness, or insulting a citizen were punished with fines or brief imprisonment. More serious offenses, such as brawling, theft, or blasphemy, could lead to expulsion from the university or even harsher penalties, including whipping or public humiliation. Despite all these hardships, life as a student in the Middle Ages was for many a precious opportunity. They had access to knowledge that was open to only a few, and the chance to rise, whether as a clergyman, teacher, or scholar. The daily routine of a medieval student often began before sunrise. When the bells of the nearby church or monastery called for morning prayer, it was also the signal for scholars and students to start their day. After a brief prayer or service, depending on piety and duty, the young men hurried to their first lectures. Classes usually started in the early morning hours, in cold, drafty rooms, or even outdoors. Since not all universities had permanent buildings, the master read aloud from a book. The students sat or stood, listened, and took notes on wax tablets or simple parchment notebooks, if they could afford them. The lecturer explained the texts, mostly in Latin, and expected the students to pay close attention, as asking questions was rarely allowed. The subjects followed the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Every student first had to learn the basics of these subjects before possibly studying theology, medicine, or law later. Particularly important was the art of disputation, skillful arguing, refuting, and defending theses, always strictly according to the rules of logic. At midday, the first part of the lessons ended, and there was a short break. The students ate whatever they could afford, often a piece of bread, some cheese, or a simple soup. After the meal, the second part of the study day began, lasting into the late afternoon. Here, too, lectures or exercises were on the schedule, reciting texts, memorizing rules, and discussing in small groups. In the evening, after sunset, it was time for study by candlelight, copying texts, or preparing for the next disputation. The day ended late, often with another prayer, and sleep was short because the next morning started just as early. Famous scholars shaped this daily life. In Paris, Thomas Aquinas taught, revolutionizing the theology and philosophy of his time. In Bologna, students learned from great legal scholars. At Oxford and Cambridge, the first colleges took form. These masters were both revered and feared, their knowledge unreachable, their words law. On feast days and special occasions, the life of medieval students was noticeably more colorful and lively than in their strict everyday routine. University towns were closely connected to the rhythm of the church calendar, providing many opportunities when the strict study schedule paused for a short time. Festivals honoring the university's saints or city patrons were especially popular. The streets filled with music, singing, and often lively games. The students, usually absorbed in their books, took the chance to gather in taverns, drink, and forget the harsh daily life for a moment. Such festivities sometimes spark small conflicts, whether between students of different nations defending their regional pride, or between students and townsfolk disturbed by the loud celebrations. There were even special student festivals, where young scholars competed in satirical speeches, poetry contests, or singing competitions. Some of these songs, the so-called vagantes psalms, became famous and have survived this day, like the verses of the Carmena Burana. While universities and schools were almost exclusively open to men, the late Middle Ages saw the emergence of the first schools for women, mostly in monasteries. There, girls were taught reading, writing, singing, and the basic rules of faith. Some of these women, such as Hildegard of Bingen, became scholars themselves, whose writings had influence far beyond the monastery walls. The relationship between the city and university was often ambivalent. Citizens saw students as a source of income. They brought money into the city, but also as troublemakers who caused unrest with their noise, nightly revelries, and often arrogant behavior. Tensions flared repeatedly. Disputes in taverns, street fights, or conflicts over privileges and taxes. Yet the universities grew and became established pillars of urban life. Their bells and lecture halls, their libraries and disputation chambers shaped the cityscape. And scholars were respected, even if sometimes regarded as out of touch or arrogant. Manuscripts, used for learning and teaching in the Middle Ages, were true treasures and a central element of school and university life. Each book was unique, handwritten on parchment, or more rarely on paper, often produced by monks in the monastery scriptoria. The effort was immense. A single work could take months or years to complete. The pages were carefully written with quills, often in black or brown ink, but sometimes adorned with red, blue, or gold colors. Initial letters, called initials, were elaborately designed and decorated with ornaments, animals, or plant motifs. Particularly valuable works contained miniatures, small painted images that illustrated the text and helped understanding. For students, these manuscripts were the most valuable possessions. Few owned their own books because they were so expensive that the value of a single volume could equal that of a house. Therefore, most worked with copies they made themselves or learned directly from a teacher's book shown during lectures. In libraries, books were often chained to prevent theft, hence the term chained library. The school year in the Middle Ages followed the church calendar. Classes usually began after the harvest festival in autumn and continued through winter and spring. There were major breaks during high feasts like Christmas, Easter, or Pentecost when schools and universities closed. During Lent, lessons were often limited because many days were dedicated to prayer and penance. The semesters were strictly structured: morning lectures, afternoon exercises, and disputations. Exams usually took place at the end of the academic year or after several years when a degree was to be earned. Over time, universities also played an important political role. They were not only places of knowledge but also centers of power. They enjoyed privileges, issued their own court rulings, and were often influential in conflicts between kings, emperors, the church, and the city. Scholars were called as advisors to courts, wrote expert opinions on ecclesiastical or secular disputes, and often acted as mediators in political conflicts. In the monastery schools, which shaped the majority of schooling in the Middle Ages, the children's day began as early as that of the university students. Even before sunrise, the monastery bell called everyone, teachers and students alike, to morning prayer, which was mandatory for all. After the prayer in the cool stone monastery church, the actual lessons began. The school day was marked by strict order. The children sat on simple benches in long rows, often in a cold, drafty room without much comfort. The teacher, usually a monk, sat at the front and dictated the material or questioned the students. Discipline was highly emphasized. Even the smallest inattentions were punished, often with a stick, a rod, or by having to copy texts as a form of penance. The main subject was Latin. The students learned to recite psalms by heart, form simple sentences, and read texts from the Bible or the writings of the church fathers. The goal was to prepare the children for a life in service of the church, as monks, priests, or scholars. Reading and singing often went hand in hand because the liturgy had to be mastered flawlessly. Writing instruction was a tedious process. At first, the children practiced on wax tablets. They carved letters into the soft wax with a stylus, and then smoothed the tablet again to make space for new exercises. Only later, when their hand was steadier, were they allowed to write with ink on parchment. Every letter had to be even, beautiful, and clear, because writing was seen as an expression of discipline and virtue. The writing tools themselves were simple: feathers from goose or raven wings, which the teacher carved and sharpened by hand. Ink was made in the monastery itself from soot, gallnuts, and other natural ingredients. Mistakes were hardly tolerated, as parchment was expensive and not easily replaceable. Despite the strictness, The monastery school offered many children the only chance to escape the hard work in the fields or workshops. Those who were especially gifted could be promoted and later become teachers, priests, or even abbots of monasteries themselves. The first scientific experiments in the Middle Ages were closely connected to teaching in monastery schools and universities, even though, from today's perspective, they were still heavily influenced by theology and philosophy. Scholars of the time saw the study of nature as a way to better understand God's creation. In schools, natural knowledge usually began with the basics of the quadrivium subjects: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Even younger students learned to perform simple arithmetic operations or draw geometric shapes. The observation of the sky especially fascinated students. The movements of the sun, moon, and stars were closely watched to determine the church calendar or the timing for sowing and harvest. True experiments were initially rare, but the observation of nature played an important role. In monastery gardens, the growth of plants was studied. Notes were taken on which herbs had healing properties or how weather affected the harvest. Such findings were collected in textbooks and passed on to the next generation. At the universities, scholars gradually tackled more difficult questions. What is the structure of the cosmos? What elements compose the world? Here they often returned to the teachings of ancient authors like Aristotle or Galen. Their writings were copied, discussed, and commented upon. Although most medieval teachers did not doubt these old authorities, a growing desire emerged to verify the book's content through personal observation. Thus, the first steps towards systematic research arose. For example, in medicine, monks and doctors conducted simple anatomical studies, dissected animals, or, where permitted, even deceased humans to explore internal organs. Monastery apothecaries mixed medicines and tested their effects. In mechanics and technology, people also experimented. They built water conduits, windmills, and clocks, steadily improving their function. Such devices served practical purposes. They helped irrigate fields, grind grain, or organize the hours of prayer. These early scientific efforts marked the beginning of a development that, in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, led to increasing curiosity and genuine experiments, until scholasticism, with its strict rules of thought and argumentation, reached its limits. The teaching methods of scholasticism deeply shaped medieval school and university life. They arose from the desire to bring the often difficult and contradictory writings of the Bible, the Church Fathers, and ancient philosophers into a unified logical system. At the center was the disputation, a formal debate following strict rules. The teacher, the magister, posed a question formulated to include a controversial thesis. This quaestio was examined from all sides. First, the opponent's arguments were presented, often beginning with videtur quod, or it seems that, then the counter-arguments, and finally the solutio, the teacher's actual solution. Students thus learned to think through and organize every argument logically. The goal was not to discover something new, but to resolve contradictions and defend the truth of traditional doctrine. The authority of great scholars played a major role. Quotations from Aristotle, Augustine, or Thomas Aquinas were considered nearly as strong as evidence. The teaching style was strict. Much was dictated, copied, and memorized. Mistakes in Latin, unclear thoughts, or illogical conclusions were immediately reprimanded. Students had to conduct disputations themselves in exams, sometimes before large audiences, with magisters deliberately trying to mislead them. The relationship between religion and science was closely intertwined in the Middle Ages. Science, as far as it meant the study of nature and the world, was always embedded in faith. Scholars saw themselves as servants of God, tasked with exploring creation to better understand and worship God. Nevertheless, tensions arose repeatedly. Sometimes new ideas or discoveries conflicted with church doctrine. The famous case of Roger Bacon in the 13th century, who emphasized the importance of experimentation, aroused skepticism among his contemporaries. Later, astronomers like Nicholas of Cusa or philosophers like William of Ockham faced criticism for ideas that deviated too much from official teachings. University libraries were true treasure troves of knowledge. They initially grew out of the book collections of monasteries and cathedrals. In reading rooms, books stood on lecterns, often secured with chains. Students were not allowed to read without supervision. Copying was strictly regulated, and borrowing was rarely permitted. The collections were small, often no more than a few dozen to several hundred volumes, but contained the most important works on theology, philosophy, medicine, and law. Student life in the residential houses of medieval university towns was marked by simplicity, community, and often chaos. Students usually lived in simple hostels, called bourses, or collegia, often provided by the university or church foundations. In these houses they lived in cramped rooms, often 2 or 3 to a chamber, with sparse furnishings. A bed or a straw mattress, a small table, perhaps a shelf for their few books or wax tablets. Life in these accommodations was not easy. There was little comfort, and winters were bitterly cold. The houses were hardly heated, and the noise from the streets penetrated the thin walls. Students had to provide their own food, which often meant eating at city inns, if they had the money. Poor students lived on alms, scholarships, or worked alongside as scribes or assistants to scholars. The daily routine was governed by rules, but there was also much freedom, which did not always end well. In many cities, citizens complained about the wild lifestyle of the students, nightly drinking bouts, fights between students from different nationalities, or with townsfolk, loud singing in the streets. Such incidents often led to strict decrees from university authorities or city leaders trying to restore order. Famous university towns included Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, and Prague, all attracting young people from across Europe. Each city had its own character. Paris was the center of theology and philosophy. Bologna was famous for the study of law. Salerno flourished in medicine. Oxford and Cambridge combined scholarship with church discipline. The cities benefited from the universities. Students brought money, boosted crafts and trade, and fostered new ideas and connections. Yet they were also a challenge, as the number of young men led to unrest and conflicts. Famous teachers shaped this era. Thomas Aquinas, who brought scholasticism to its peak. Albertus Magnus, who linked natural science and theology. Peter Abelard, whose teaching and tragic life attracted both students and enemies. They were all revered, their lectures were overcrowded, and their writings were copied and studied throughout Europe. Examinations and degrees at medieval universities were strict, ceremonial affairs marking the culmination of years of study. Unlike today, there were no regular tests or midterms. Instead, at the end of a long period of study, the student's entire acquired knowledge was assessed. The most important form of examination was the public disputation. The candidate had to defend a thesis or solve a controversial problem before an assembled audience, consisting of professors, students, and often interested townspeople. The examiners posed tricky questions, quoted difficult passages from the works of ancient masters, or tried to trap the candidate in logical pitfalls. The goal was to demonstrate that the student had fully mastered the art of argumentation and the content of their subject. At the end came the solemn ceremony of awarding the degree. The first academic title was the baccalaureus, which formed the basis for further advancement. Those who continued studying and proved themselves in further disputations could earn the title magister or doctor, a highly respected rank that often qualified the holder for a professorship or a church office. Women played hardly any role in this system. Universities were exclusively reserved for men, although noble women or nuns in monasteries could obtain education and make names for themselves as learned women, such as Hildegard of Bingen or later Christine de Pizan. The path to an official university degree remained closed to them. Women were only admitted to universities many centuries later. Curricula developed over the course of the Middle Ages. Originally, theology was central. It was considered the queen of the sciences, but over time, other subjects gained greater importance. Canon and secular law, medicine, philosophy, and the arts liberales, the foundational knowledge of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The structure was clearly organized. Young men first studied the artes as preparation, then specialized in one of the higher subjects. The course of study could last many years, 10, 12, or even longer, depending on the subject and the student's ambition. The relationship between students and the town population in the Middle Ages was often tense and full of conflicts, a connection marked by mutual benefit but frequent trouble. Although universities were important economic and cultural engines for their cities, attracting money to inns, hostels, writing shops, and markets, and drawing pilgrims, merchants, and scholars due to their esteemed reputations, coexistence was not easy. Students were seen as loud, reckless, and quarrelsome. Many were young men far from home, without family nearby, testing their newfound freedom. Drunkenness, noise, fights with the sons of local craftsmen or the servants of inns were common. The so-called scholars' uprisings are well documented in chronicles. Students sometimes rebelled against city authorities when they felt unfairly treated, such as during tax demands or after a fellow student's arrest. Conversely, students often saw themselves as a distinct community with special rights. Many universities had imperial or papal privileges, granting them a form of self-administration and their own judiciary. This meant students were subject to ecclesiastical or university courts, not city courts. These special rights repeatedly caused conflicts when citizens complained about the fool's freedom of scholars. Famous libraries were the heart of medieval universities and monasteries. The Sorbonne Library in Paris, the Oxford Library, the collection in Bologna, all guarded the most valuable manuscripts of the time. Bibles, works of the Church Fathers, Aristotle's philosophy, medical writings by Galen or Avicenna. Books were precious because they were painstakingly copied by hand onto parchment. Often they were chained to reading desks to prevent theft. Only a few students were allowed to borrow books. The reading usually took place under supervision. The first scientific discoveries in these institutions were often still closely linked to theology, but the desire to understand the world more precisely began to grow. Astronomers like Johannes de Sacrobosco wrote textbooks about the movement of celestial bodies, which remained standard works for centuries. Physicians like Constantine the African or the scholars of Salerno translated and commented on Arabic and ancient texts, bringing new knowledge to Europe. The relationship between university and church in the Middle Ages was characterized by close interconnection and occasional tensions. Most universities were founded under the protection of the church, established by bishops, granted privileges by the Pope, and often under ecclesiastical supervision. Theology was considered the highest field of study, and many professors and students were clergy or had received minor orders. The church viewed universities as bastions of faith. They were meant to preserve and defend the teachings of the Holy Scripture, church fathers, and great theologians against heresies. Therefore, the church kept a vigilant eye on what was taught at these institutions. New ideas that deviated too much from official doctrine could quickly attract suspicion from church authorities. Famous are cases where professors or entire faculties came into conflict with the church. For example, in Paris, Aristotle's writings on nature were banned when it was feared they might conflict with Christian teachings. Later, they were allowed again, often with the caveat that they had to be read in the light of faith. Philosophers like Meister Eckhart or Roger Bacon also came under scrutiny if their ideas seemed too bold or experimental. Professors' lives were respected yet often marked by hardship. They enjoyed esteem and influence, but were burdened with endless lectures, disputations, and administrative duties. Many lived modestly, especially the younger masters. Only those who held a chair at a famous university or had patrons in the church or among princes could afford a somewhat more comfortable lifestyle. Professors often lived in small houses near the universities, where they also received their students. They were revered by their students but sometimes feared, especially when they acted particularly harsh and relentless during disputation. Great scholars like Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, or Peter Abelard attracted students from all over Europe and continued to be read and cited centuries after their deaths. The influence of Arabic science was enormous and often underestimated at this time. While many ancient works were lost or forgotten in Western Europe, Arab scholars had preserved, translated, and developed them. Through Spain and Sicily, these writings, such as those of Aristotle, Galen, or Ptolemy, returned to Europe in the High Middle Ages. Especially the Arabic commentaries and expansions impressed European scholars. They learned algebra basics from Al-Khwarizmi, medicine and philosophy from Avicenna and Averroes, Optics from Alhazen. Translation schools, for example in Toledo, made this knowledge accessible. It shaped university curricula, inspired new questions, and laid the groundwork for the later scientific revolution. The daily routine of a medieval student was strictly regulated and characterized by duty, discipline, and a simple lifestyle. The day began early, often at dawn. Even before the city fully awoke, the scholars made their way to the first lectures. In the cold morning hours, they sat in dark, sparsely heated lecture halls or chapels, where the master dictated or commented from a book. The main language was Latin, not only in class but also in the students' everyday communication. Those who did not master Latin could neither follow the lessons nor succeed in disputations. From the beginning of their studies, students had to learn to think and argue in this language. The mornings were devoted to lectures. First, the lectura ordinaria, mandatory sessions where foundational works like Peter Lombard's Sentences, Aristotle's Logic, or standard medical texts were read and explained. Then came the lecturae extraordinaria, often deeper or supplementary courses. After lunch, which mostly consisted of simple bread, cheese, some vegetables, or a stew, students attended exercises, private study, or smaller disputations. Many used this time to read in the library, copy texts, or study together. Evenings offered opportunities for larger disputations, where students deepened their understanding of the material. The nations, groups of students from the same region, played an important role. These associations provided protection and community. In Paris, for example, there were the nations of the French, Picards, English, and Germans. They elected their own representatives, held meetings, and took responsibility for their members' behavior. In conflicts with the city or university, the nations appeared as united groups. The nations had their own customs, coats of arms, and sometimes even their own houses or hostels. On ceremonial occasions like a master's graduation or church festivals, they appeared united, lending the university ceremonies a colorful international character. Famous conflicts between the city and the university are well documented. One of the best known happened in Paris in 1229. After a dispute between students and townspeople, a massacre occurred in which many scholars were killed. The university then halted its work. A university then halted its work. A university-wide strike lasting several years. Only after papal mediation was the conflict resolved, and the university received new, far-reaching privileges. Such disputes were not isolated. Universities repeatedly clashed with cities over taxes, judicial rights, or student provisions. These conflicts show how autonomous and powerful medieval universities already were, and how much they shaped urban life.